this short video presentation, I want to cover some of the main points about Constable's technique of painting outdoors, so that when you come to paint in the landscape with me, I'll demonstrate again while we're out there, but you'll have had some basic ideas introduced to you, which I think will be very useful, because being in the landscape can be slightly overwhelming. So to have gone over these points in advance is not a bad idea. So this is a study, Dedham Vale from East Bergholt to Flatford Mill from 1809. Constable, just to say briefly, generally divided his time between the summer when he was out painting in the landscape, painting on a small scale, very often on prepared paper, in oil, with colours that he mixed on his palette. He pinned the bit of paper to the lid of his paint box and worked on a small scale in front of his subject. Then in the winter months, he would go to his studio in Hampstead in London, and using these studies, he would then work on much larger, sometimes 6 foot in scale or oil paintings. So what we're going to be working with is Constable's approach to painting outdoors on a relatively small scale. And I'm just going to point out one or two things with this study, which I'll then be demonstrating. I'm going to do a transcription of this painting as an illustration of the technique. So firstly, Constable would paint on a prepared surface. So his canvas wasn't white, it was a sort of reddy brown. And there are just one or two places I'm going to point out where you can actually see bits of red showing through. So he would paint on this warm red surface. He would then block in larger areas. For example, the sky would have been probably painted all with the same blue colour. Something probably the darker blue, because generally he worked from dark to light. And then areas like the clouds would have been painted into that blue. And as a result of that, you get this lovely natural accidental mixing of colours, so that there are soft transitions from one colour to the next. I've missed out a stage. Before that, well, this is certainly what I'm going to do. I'm guessing this is what he did. There would have been a bit of drawing with some dark paint. So particularly these dark shapes, to see where some of the main areas were. But an area like the sky and other big areas would have been covered with the same colour, and then the lighter colours worked into them. And depending on how much mixing he wanted, whether he wanted a transition like this from the darker blue to the lighter blue, or whether he wanted a very clean, fresh, bright, light colour like some of these clouds, he would manage that mixing by either floating the paint on the surface or working it in, mixing it on the painting. Again, I'll show you what that means in a moment. But lastly, so that all of that, when I demonstrate, I'm going to be using number 6. I think this was a square brush. It's turned into a bit of a filbert now with sort of rounded edges. But a number 6 hoghair brush. And then towards the end of the process, Constable would have used a sable brush, a small, thin brush that could, with soft hair, that could be brought to a point. And there are various places in the painting with very small, fine marks, which are the last stage in a process. So as I described, I'm preparing my white canvas surface. This is a canvas board. I'm preparing it with a dark red-brown. I've mixed some black and some cadmium red with a little bit of white. And I'm surprised at how dark it is, but this very much is the look of the surface that Constable worked on. And I think part of the principle is firstly not to be painting on white, so there isn't a distraction of the white surface. I mean, other artists, the Impressionists notably, did actually work on white. But part of it is to have this warm colour showing through. So when the cool colours, the blues and the greens of the landscape go on, they respond, they contrast with that warm background. Another reason is that it's a wet surface, and that means that the colours will flow a little bit more easily on top of the wet surface. I just want to show you my palette. So I'm in the studio for this transcription, and I've been mixing with my palette knife some of the colours that I'm going to be working with, the main colours that are in this composition. So this is the red-black, which I added some white to make my ground, the red-brown that I'm painting on. And I'm now going to paint with that red-black, get some of the main shapes drawn out in a dark colour. I've made some colours for the sky, and this is a cerulean blue with a little bit of my brown-black, red-black mixture and some yellow ochre. I'll go over all these colours with you when we're outdoors. The principle that you should see here is that I've pre-mixed these colours, and as I mix a colour, I take some of my medium, which is the linseed oil and the terps, and I mix it through my mixtures. So I'm using a palette knife to pre-mix those colours, and I've done some of the main ones. I haven't done all of them because it can become a bit disheartening. You want to get on with painting, and you feel that all you're doing is mixing colours, but it's very valuable to have a number ready and actually to go through a process of mixing and then painting for a while and then stopping painting so that you prepare enough colour and enough clean colour often for the next stage. So I'll begin with some of that drawing stage that I talked about. So this is the red-black mixture, and I'm doing a transcription, so I'm looking at Constable's sketch with my eyes half closed just to see where these dark shapes are. And this is a guide, this is a drawing guide to my subject. When you're in the landscape, I'm going to encourage you to do some quick thumbnail sketches in charcoal, maybe charcoal and chalk, even a little bit of pastel if you want. And what I hope you'll be looking for, what it'll help you find, is a composition that interests you, something that you can work with. And by doing one or two thumbnails, that's working on a small scale and quickly, you'll give yourselves a bit of a choice. So this bit of under drawing, under painting, is to help me find where these particularly dark shapes are going to be. And it's also, in a way, it's part of this process of working from dark to light. So that's what I need. It's been diluted with a little bit of the spirit, and then as a next stage, I'm going to start, as I described, blocking in big areas of colour. And so for this now, I've mixed the medium into the paint, and I'm just blocking in some of that colour. So what I should point out now, I don't know how well you'll see this on the camera, but because I've painted my blue into my red-brown, the colour on the tip of my brush is no longer clean. So it might be useful in certain places to use that less clean colour. I mean, in fact, it's probably okay to get some of it down here because I'm painting back into it. But if I want to have clean colour, I need to clean my brush, or at least wipe my brush, so that the next bit of paint that I pick up is clean and can go on cleanly to the surface of my painting. So my drawing gives me a guide as to where these dark shapes of the tree, for example, are going to be, and so I can paint round that. But because everything is wet, there will be a mixing. But that really is part of the beauty of oil paint, that it'll mix on the painting. So I've now got a slightly lighter version of my sky colour, and as I apply it, it's going to mix a bit with what's underneath, and also with the lighter blue that I put on. What's on the end of my brush now is not clean, so I've got to wipe that. And as I say, if necessary, I could even clean it in spirit. But that's now given me the transition from lighter to darker. But I think I should really, if I were to do what I describe in Constable, I should get a bit more down here so that I'm working into wet paint. Because I've mixed a lighter colour for the clouds, and I want to get that on top. Still, everything's being done with this number 6 brush, and you see that ideally I don't move the paint about very much. Everything is done fairly directly on the surface. And we've got some bits through here. So because I'm painting on this wet surface, I am picking up some of the red-brown, and I'm not covering the red-brown completely. So that has a really good unifying effect. It means that bits of red-brown appear in the gaps between my colours, and also that every colour that I apply is mixed a bit with the red-brown. So then I've made some colours for the trees, and as I described, it's working dark to light. So I look at my painting, or you might look at I look at Constable's sketch, or you might look at your landscape with your eyes half closed and see the dark shapes. So most of that tree I can get down as dark without losing too much of that colour, without too much of that mixing. And then into that dark I'll gradually apply lighter colours. And I suppose I'm trying to work with an appropriate sort of mark, texture, pattern. As I apply the paint, I'm looking at the textures of the leaves, the trees, the foliage that Constable has used in that area. Maybe to contrast that with somewhere else, like the texture of the clouds, I hope I was applying the paint in a different way. I'm just going to mix a little bit more. So as I said, I'm working from dark to light, and also from big areas to smaller areas. So that's some of the darker areas of tree and foliage. And for example, with the tree, I've got now a lighter colour that I'm going to work in, that I'm going to apply, and I'm going to manage the amount of working in, the amount of mixing, by the way I apply the paint. So I'm holding my brush almost parallel to the painting, and that means I can float the colour on top. If I work the colour, as I was doing a bit with the sky. And by work it, I mean I allow it to mix on the surface. Then the colour will be less clear, less bright. So it's managing that mixing. So that's some of the lighter colour there. And then of course there can often be an order in which you need to sort of think through what you do, what next, for example. So here I've got this hedge running in front of this orange field. I know where the hedge is, but what I'm going to do next is put in the orange field, and then later I'll paint the hedge over it. So there's a certain amount of deconstructing of your scene, of your subject, which is necessary, is helpful. So I want this orange colour to be, nice and bright. And it also, it's great the way it appears the other side of that tree trunk. So I need to be aware again of what's on the end of my brush. If it is going, it may mix, but I need to know that. So that's, my brush now isn't clean. There may be places where it's all right to have just a hint of orange showing through the hedge. But if I wanted it to be bright, the original bright orange, then I'll need to clean my brush and pick up fresh paint. And there's another part of the painting which has got a nice light and colour to it. That's some of this footpath here. So again, I want to be aware just of how much paint. I need to know what's on the tip of my brush. That's basically it. So that's how this process would proceed. I'm going to do one more thing. Well, I'm going to block in this middle bit and then show you a little bit of work with the sable brush, because everything thus far has been done with the same brush. So I've still got some of these larger areas to block in. And I'm not going to get everything painted. But if we just get those in, I'm going to then show you how I'm going to transfer from this number 6 brush, which I hope you can see. Sometimes I'm using it on its side if I want to make a thinner mark, and sometimes I'm turning it a bit to get a different size mark. I think we've got something in here as well. But it's still this principle of working with working from dark to light, and also from big shapes to smaller shapes. So lastly, what I want to do with a sable brush, so that's a thin brush that can be brought to a point, which won't pick up very much paint, but will be more suited to painting quite small marks. So for example, as I get into some of this sort of middle ground area, there are trees. I've got a hair there to pick that off. There are trees. I don't know how well you see that. That doesn't make a big difference. Let's try something different. Work with some of these smaller areas here. So this is coming to the end of the process and putting in, I suppose they might be called details, smaller adjustments, but I'm still having to work with wet paint, but that's something that I'm managing. I don't pick up very much paint on this small brush, and so each time I make a mark, it's got to be fairly rapid, decisive, and then I'll have to get fresh paint if I want to keep that kind of contrast. And I can only really apply these kinds of detailed marks now because I've kept a unity in the painting through the things I did first, working with the larger brush and the larger shapes. So this is very much for the end and for putting in finer observations. And certainly when you're painting in the landscape, I'll be encouraging you to work with the big brush as much as possible. And even at this stage, I can go back and get more paint, more colour, if necessary, into parts of the painting. So I can freshen up what's there, I can restate it, and if the worst comes to the worst and something really isn't working, then I can even wipe it off. So that's as much as I want to do to the transcription. Those of you who are out painting in the landscape, I'll go over some of this with you again. There are some people who will be working at home, purely online, and I'll be furnishing them with photographs of our landscape settings so that they can follow this process, but in an indoor way. I'm going to add a little bit on the end here when I'm going to do something outside, just to prepare you for some of the aspects of that experience. So this is where we're going to begin our landscape with Constable course. Jock Tamson's garden, which is next to Duddingston Kirk. And I'm going to get you to begin by making small thumbnail sketches. You'll have a viewfinder, you'll look through your viewfinder, maybe wander around the garden and make a selection of possibilities for compositions. And then I'll have you working with some thumbnail sketches, charcoal and chalk, and maybe a little bit of pastel to choose some compositions. And from those you can then start this process of making an oil sketch following some of the steps that I've shown you in the demonstration, which are inspired by Constable's approach. And for those working online, I've taken photographs of this fabulous setting from different points of view, and you'll be able to follow the same process of beginning with little studies, thumbnail sketches, and then developing them into oil paintings on the basis of those ideas.